June 22nd, 1943, 15 in the morning. The darkness along the Soviet border held its breath. Private Otto Brenner crouched in the tall grass, his 19-year-old hands trembling against the cold metal of his Mauser rifle. Around him, thousands of German soldiers waited in absolute silence. The only sound was the whisper of wind through wheat fields that stretched endlessly toward the east. Otto had never been this far from home. Bavaria felt like another world now, another lifetime. The farm, his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking on Sunday mornings. All of it, impossibly distant. All of it, waiting for him to return. Beside him, his best friend Hans shifted position. 20 years old, blonde hair, and a grin that never seemed to fade. Even now, in the pre-dawn darkness, even with war about to begin, Hans managed a whisper. Nervous. Farm boy. Otto swallowed hard. Aren't you? Terrified, Hans admitted. Then that grin again. But we do it together. You and me, brothers. They had met during basic training 6 months ago. Two boys from Bavaria who bunked next to each other and discovered they were born in villages only 15 kilometers apart. The friendship had been instant, complete, more than friendship. Really, brotherhood. The kind forged not by blood, but by something deeper. Trust. The absolute certainty that the man next to you would die before letting you fall. Further down the line, Sergeant Franz checked his watch for the 10th time in as many minutes. 30 years old, a veteran of the Polish campaign. Franz had seen combat before. His face bore the weathered look of experience, the cautious eyes of a man who knew what bullets could do to flesh. 3 minutes, Franz whispered to the squad. Check your ammunition. Check your grenades. And when it starts, stay low. The first wave always takes the worst of it. The youngest of them, Dieter, barely 18, clutched his rifle like a drowning man gripping driftwood. His hand shook visibly. Franz placed a rough hand on the boy's shoulder. Breathe, kid. Just breathe. Stay close to me. Do what I do, and you'll see sunrise tomorrow. 300 meters behind the forward positions, Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Richter stood beside his command vehicle, binoculars raised toward the distant Soviet border posts. 43 years old, decorated veteran of the Great War, the Knight's Cross gleaming at his throat. Richter had spent 25 years in uniform. He believed in duty. He believed in Germany. And most of all, he believed in the Führer's promise. 6 weeks. Moscow would fall in 6 weeks. His adjutant, a nervous young lieutenant, approached with a folder of final reports. Sir, all units report ready. Artillery is ranged and loaded. The panzers are positioned for breakthrough. We await only the signal. Richter nodded slowly, still staring through his binoculars at the sleeping Soviet positions. Somewhere over there, men just like Otto and Hans lay sleeping in their bunks, unaware that in moments their world would explode into fire and death. For just an instant, something flickered across Richter's weathered face. Not quite doubt, not yet, but perhaps the shadow of a question. He had fought in the trenches of Verdun in 1916. He had seen what modern war could do. He had watched an entire generation drown in mud and blood. This time, they promised, would be different. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, speed and shock, an overwhelming force. No trenches, no stalemate, just swift, decisive victory. Sir, the adjutant prompted. Richter lowered his binoculars. Pass the word. On my mark, commence Operation Barbarossa. The adjutant saluted sharply and disappeared into the darkness. Richter checked his own watch. 15 seconds. 10, 5, 3, 15 a.m. exactly. Now, the world ended in thunder. 3,000 German artillery pieces opened now fire simultaneously along an 800-mile front. The sound was beyond description. Not noise. Something deeper. A physical force that hammered the chest, that turned air itself into a weapon. The night sky lit up like noon. Shells screamed overhead in endless waves, arcing towards Soviet positions with terrible beauty. Otto pressed himself flat against the earth as the barrage roared overhead. The ground beneath him shook so violently he thought it might split open. Beside him, Hans was shouting something, but Otto couldn't hear. The artillery had stolen all sound, all thought, everything except the pure animal terror of being so close to such apocalyptic violence. The shells landed. Explosions bloomed across the Soviet border, like evil flowers. Earth and fire and destruction beyond comprehension. German artillery crews had spent weeks registering every Soviet position, every bunker, every defensive line. Now they reaped the harvest of that preparation. With ruthless efficiency, Soviet soldiers died in their beds, never knowing what hit them. Entire barracks vanished in single explosions. Machine gun nests became craters. The few Soviet aircraft parked at forward airfields erupted in flames before their pilots could even reach them. For 30 minutes, the barrage continued. 30 minutes of hell poured onto men who had been sleeping peacefully just moments before. Then silence fell. Not true silence. Ears ringing. The crackle of fires. Distant screams. But compared to the artillery, it felt like silence. Forward. Franz's voice cut through the smoke. Move. Move. Otto scrambled to his feet, legs shaking. All around him, thousands of German soldiers emerged from the tall grass, like ghosts materializing from fog. They advanced in perfect formation, weapons ready, moving toward an enemy that had just been obliterated. Hans grabbed Otto's shoulder. Stay close. Don't get separated. They ran together across the torn earth. Otto's boots splashed through the puddles that had been created by shellfire. The acrid smell of high explosives burned his nostrils. Smoke drifted across the landscape in thick curtains. The Soviet border defenses had simply ceased to exist. Bunkers lay in ruins. Trenches had collapsed. Bodies lay scattered like discarded toys. Some Soviet soldiers had survived the barrage, emerging from shelters with dazed, terrified eyes. Most dropped their weapons immediately, hands raised in surrender. Otto saw his first prisoner, a young Soviet soldier, maybe his own age, bleeding from a head wound, stumbling toward the German lines with both hands high above his head. The boy was crying, saying something in Russian that Otto couldn't understand but recognized anyway. The universal language of fear. A German corporal grabbed the Soviet soldier and shoved him toward the rear, toward the gathering cages where thousands would soon be penned like cattle. Keep moving, Franz barked. We're not here to take prisoners. Let the rear guard handle them. Our job is to break through. The squad pressed forward. Around them, the full weight of the Wehrmacht began its inexorable advance. Panzer tanks, black and menacing, engines roaring, churning across the broken ground. Their treads crushed everything in their path. Infantry followed in the tank's wake, pouring through gaps like water through a broken dam. The Luftwaffe screamed overhead. Stukas, their sirens wailing like demons, dove on the few Soviet positions still showing resistance. Bombs fell with terrible precision. Explosions walked across the landscape, methodical and merciless. This was Blitzkrieg. This was the lightning war that had crushed Poland in weeks, that had driven France to surrender in 40 days. Speed, shock, overwhelming violence. The enemy couldn't react, couldn't adapt, couldn't do anything except break and run. And the Soviets ran. Those who survived the initial barrage fled eastward in panic. Some tried to organize resistance at river crossings, at village strong points. German tanks and dive bombers smashed these attempts with brutal efficiency. By noon of the first day, the Wehrmacht had advanced 30 kilometers. Otto's squad moved with the tide. They cleared villages that had been abandoned in panic. They passed columns of Soviet prisoners, hundreds becoming thousands, all marching west with empty eyes and slumped shoulders. The roads filled with refugees, old women, children, entire families fleeing the advancing German army with whatever possessions they could carry. Hans found a Soviet officer's cap, placed it on his head at a jaunty angle, and struck a pose. How do I look? Think they'll make me a general. Despite everything, despite the fear and the death they had witnessed, Otto found himself laughing. The sound felt strange, almost wrong, but also necessary. A brief moment of humanity in the midst of mechanized slaughter. Franz, ever cautious, shook his head. Take that off. Dress like the enemy, and someone might shoot you. Hans tossed the cap aside with a theatrical shrug. No sense of humor. Franz, we just won. The greatest victory in history, and you're worried about fashion. We won a battle? Franz corrected. The war's just starting. But that first day, that first glorious, terrible day, it seemed like Franz might be wrong. It seemed like the war was already over. The Soviet defenses had collapsed like a house of cards. German units were advancing so fast that communication couldn't keep up. Entire Soviet armies were being surrounded, cut off, destroyed. Night fell. The squad dug in at a collective farm 25 kilometers inside Soviet territory. They ate cold rations and smoked captured Soviet cigarettes that tasted terrible but were better than nothing. Dieter, the youngest, sat apart from the others, staring at his hands. Otto moved to sit beside him. You all right? Dieter's voice came out barely above a whisper. I killed someone today. We all did. No. Dieter's hands trembled. I saw his face. He was trying to surrender, and I pulled the trigger before I even thought about it. He just fell down, just like that. And I kept running. And now I can't stop seeing. Otto didn't know what to say. He was 19 years old, had left his family farm for the first time 6 months ago, and war was supposed to make sense. Glory and honor, and defending the fatherland. But sitting there in the darkness with Dieter's voice breaking, none of it made sense at all. Hans appeared from the darkness, sat down on Dieter's other side. He didn't say anything at first, just handed Dieter half a chocolate bar. First time's the hardest, Hans said quietly. Franz told me that. Said it gets easier. Does it? Dieter asked. Hans hesitated. I don't know yet, but we're together. That's what matters. We keep each other human. They sat like that for a long time. 3 hours from Bavaria. Impossibly far from home. Trying to make sense of the unspeakable. 200 meters away, Lieutenant Colonel Richter stood outside his command vehicle, reviewing intelligence reports by flashlight. The news was extraordinary. All along the front, Soviet forces were collapsing. Minsk would fall within days. The road to Smolensk lay wide open, and beyond Smolensk, only 300 kilometers to Moscow. His adjutant approached with a bottle of schnapps and 2 glasses. A toast, sir, to the first day of our greatest victory. Richter accepted a glass, but didn't drink immediately. He stared eastward into the darkness, toward Moscow, toward the heart of the Soviet Empire. Greatest victory, he murmured. Yes, perhaps, sir. Richter shook his head. Nothing, just a feeling. In the Great War, we had feelings sometimes. Premonitions usually proved wrong. He raised his glass to victory. They drank. The schnapps burned going down. Somewhere in the darkness, a Soviet artillery piece, missed by the initial barrage, fired a single shell. It exploded harmlessly in an empty field, a final gesture of defiance from an army in full retreat. The days blurred together. June became July, became August. The Wehrmacht advanced like a perfect machine. Every morning, they moved east. Every evening, they dug in, counted their ammunition, and prepared to move east again tomorrow. Otto's squad became a tight unit, brothers in every sense that mattered. Hans remained the joker, finding humor even in the worst moments. Franz led them with steady competence, the veteran who knew when to push and when to hold back. Dieter slowly hardened, the innocence bleeding out of him day by day. And Otto discovered something about himself. He was good at this, good at soldiering. His aim was steady, his reactions quick. When Franz needed someone to scout ahead or take point on a dangerous crossing, it was Otto he called on. The farm boy from Bavaria, who had never been in a fight before basic training, now moved through combat zones with growing confidence. They shared everything. When rations were short, they divvied up the food equally, down to the last crumb. When Hans got a care package from home, cookies his mother had baked, he distributed them with solemn ceremony. One for Franz, one for Dieter, one for Otto, one for himself. These are probably older than we are, Hans joked, biting into a cookie that had indeed gone stale during the long journey from Bavaria. But damn if they don't taste like home. Otto savored his cookie slowly, making it last. The taste brought back memories so powerful they hurt. His mother's kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the sound of his father's voice calling him in from the fields. A world that seemed to exist in another dimension, now separated from this present reality of smoke and blood by an unbridgeable gulf. Tell me about your farm, Franz said one evening as they sat around a small fire. What did you grow? Wheat mostly, Otto replied. Some barley, potatoes. My father always said the land provides if you respect it. Learn its rhythms. Work with it, not against it, Hans laughed. Listen to the philosopher. Next you'll be writing poetry. Maybe I will. Otto shot back. Once we get home, I'll write an epic poem about how Hans snores like a dying pig. The squad erupted in laughter. Even Franz allowed himself a smile. These moments became precious. Brief islands of humanity in an ocean of mechanized violence. They learned each other's stories, each other's dreams. Hans wanted to open a pub back in Bavaria, a place where veterans could gather and share memories. Franz had a wife and 2 daughters waiting for him. He carried their picture there in a leather wallet that he showed to anyone who would look. Dieter wanted to be a teacher, to work with children, to build something, instead of destroying. And Otto didn't know what he wanted. The war had come before he'd had time to figure out who he was supposed to become. So he listened to the others' dreams and hoped that someday, somehow, he'd survive long enough to discover his own. Lieutenant Colonel Richter watched his battalion advance with growing satisfaction. They were ahead of schedule, ahead of projections. His men were performing magnificently. Casualties remained light. Morale was high. Every metric indicated complete success. He sent regular reports to high command, each one confirming the overall picture. Soviet resistance was crumbling. The Red Army fought in isolated pockets, but showed no capacity for organized defense. Entire Soviet armies were being surrounded and destroyed in vast encirclements. At Minsk, 300,000 Soviet soldiers surrendered. At Smolensk, another 300,000. The numbers became almost meaningless. How do you comprehend such catastrophic defeat? But Richter, veteran of the Great War, began to notice things, small things at first. The supply convoys were arriving later each day. Fuel requisitions took longer to fill. Replacement parts for vehicles became harder to obtain. The roads behind the advancing front were clogged with damaged trucks, broken down tanks, vehicles that had simply worn out from the relentless pace of advance. He raised these concerns in his reports. High Command responded with reassurances. Everything was under control. The supply situation was adequate. Focus on the advance. Richter focused on the advance. August turned to September. The seasons were changing. The summer heat began to fade. Night temperatures dropped. Morning dew covered the grass with silver. With silver? One morning, Otto's squad came across a burned village. Not unusual. They had passed dozens of burned villages. The scorched earth policy. Soviet forces destroying everything as they retreated, leaving nothing for the advancing Germans. But this village held something different. Franz found it first. A photograph, half burned, lying in the ruins of what had been a home. A family portrait. Father, mother, 3 children. All of them smiling. Franz picked up the photograph carefully, stared at it for a long moment. His face, usually so controlled, showed something Otto had never seen before. Doubt, uncertainty, perhaps even shame. They're people, Franz said quietly. Just people, with families. Children. Hans shifted uncomfortably. They're the enemy. Are they? Franz looked at the photograph again. These children. Are they my enemy? Am I their enemy? Franz, Hans began. I have daughters, Franz continued. Voice distant. Same age as these kids. If someone came to my village, burned my home, killed my family. He trailed off, placed the photograph carefully on a piece of rubble, as if creating a tiny memorial. They're just people. No one spoke. The truth of Franz's words hung in the air like the smoke from the burned village. They were invading someone else's country, destroying someone else's homes. These weren't abstract enemies. These were people, human beings with families and children, and dreams that would never be realized. Otto felt something shift inside him, a crack in the certainty he'd been clinging to. They were fighting for Germany, for the fatherland, for the Führer's vision of a better world. But what about these people? What about their world? We don't have a choice, Dieter said quietly. We're soldiers. We follow orders. Franz picked up his rifle. Yes, we follow orders. He looked at each of them in turn. But we remember. We remember their people. We don't become monsters. They moved on. But the photograph stayed with Otto. That night, as he tried to sleep, he couldn't stop seeing those children's faces, smiling, unaware that someday soon their world would burn. September 15th arrived with morning frost on the grass. The squad had been in the field for 12 weeks, longer than the 6 weeks the Führer had promised. But Moscow was close now. Only 300 kilometers. They could almost taste victory. Lieutenant Colonel Richter stood in his command post, studying maps that no longer made sense. The mathematics were wrong. They had been advancing for 12 weeks. They were indeed only 300 kilometers from Moscow. But they had also consumed far more fuel, ammunition, and supplies than projected. The replacement rate for vehicles was unsustainable. Mechanical breakdowns were accelerating. And most troubling of all, there had been no official word from High Command about the 6-week promise. Richter had been a soldier, long enough to recognize a lie by omission. The silence spoke volumes. They should have been in Moscow by now. They should have been preparing for victory parades. Instead, they were 300 kilometers away, with depleting supplies and no clear timeline. He did the mathematics. At their current rate of advance, accounting for increasing Soviet resistance, deteriorating roads, and supply constraints, they might reach Moscow by November. December. Winter. The word appeared in his mind unbidden. Unwelcome. Winter in Russia. Napoleon had learned that lesson in 1812. The Grande Armée had marched to Moscow in triumph and frozen to death on the retreat. But this was 1940. They had modern vehicles, modern logistics, modern everything. Winter wouldn't matter. Except his logistics reports showed something disturbing. No winter clothing was scheduled to arrive until December, at the earliest. The Wehrmacht had been equipped for a summer campaign. 6 weeks, in and out, before the snow fell. 12 weeks in, and they were still advancing, still fighting, still 300 kilometers from the objective. Richter sent an urgent inquiry to High Command. What is the contingency plan for winter operations? The response came back 3 days later. Brief, almost dismissive. Continue current operations. Moscow will fall before winter weather becomes a factor. Richter read the message 3 times. Felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition? He had seen this before. In 1918, when the German High Command had continued offensive operations long past the point of sustainability, when pride and momentum had overridden military reality, he drafted a response, carefully worded, respectfully phrased, but honest. His battalion needed winter equipment. His vehicles needed winterized parts. His men needed warmer uniforms. He sent the message and waited. No response came. Otto's squad received new orders. Push toward Vyazma. Encircle Soviet forces there. Another massive encirclement. Another 100,000 prisoners. Another victory. They moved out at dawn. The morning was cold. Colder than it should have been for mid-September. Hans breathed out and watched his breath fog in the air, getting chilly. He observed Franz, checked the sky. Clouds gathering from the north. Winter comes early. This far east. We'll be in Moscow before winter, Dieter said with the certainty of youth. The Fuhrer promised. Franz said nothing. But Otto saw the look in the veteran's eyes. The same doubt that had been growing in Otto's own mind. They marched east, toward Vyazma, toward Moscow, toward something none of them could quite name, but all of them could feel, a gathering storm, a reckoning. The encirclement at Vyazma succeeded brilliantly. Another 600,000 Soviet soldiers surrounded. Another catastrophic defeat for the Red Army. German casualties remained relatively light. Tactically, strategically, by every measurable metric, the campaign was succeeding beyond all expectations. Except the calendar. September ended. October began. 13 weeks, 14 weeks, 15 weeks. And then, on October 30th, the first snow fell. Otto woke to find the world transformed. White, pure, beautiful. The snow had fallen during the night, covering the scarred landscape like a clean sheet pulled over a wounded body. For a moment, just a moment, it was breathtakingly lovely. Hans emerged from his tent, grinning. About time. The mud's been killing us. Now the ground will freeze, and the tanks can move properly again. It was true. The autumn rains had turned the roads to soup. Vehicles bogged down constantly. Progress had slowed to a crawl. But with the ground frozen, they could advance across open country. The snow was actually good news. Richter stood outside his command vehicle, watching the snowfall. His breath came out in white plumes. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees overnight. He had checked the thermometer twice, not believing the reading. -10 degrees Celsius. In October, his adjutant approached, holding a weather report from High Command. Richter read it carefully. Unseasonably cold temperatures expected to continue. Heavy snow forecasted for November. And still, no winter clothing. No winterized vehicles. No cold weather supplies. Because they were supposed to be in Moscow by now. The campaign was supposed to be over. The war was supposed to be won. Richter crumpled the weather report slowly in his fist. For the first time since June 22nd, he allowed himself to think the unthinkable. We've been lied to. Not about tactical situations. Not about enemy dispositions. About something more fundamental. About the entire premise of the campaign. 6 weeks to Moscow. A swift, decisive victory before winter. The snow continued to fall, soft and silent and beautiful, covering the world in white. And with it came the cold. Not brutal yet. Not the deep freeze of a Russian winter. But enough. Enough to know that worse was coming. Far to the east, in the frozen wastes of Siberia, Sergeant Dmitri Antonov received his orders. His division was being redeployed. From the Far East to the Moscow front. He was going home, going to war. Dmitri had been born in Yakutsk, where winter temperatures regularly dropped to -50 and so. He had hunted bear in conditions that would kill a normal man in hours. The cold was not his enemy. The cold was his ally. He wrote a letter to his wife before departing. Simple, direct. The Germans are coming to Moscow. They don't know our winter. They don't know our land. Let them come. Let them come into the cold. We'll be waiting. He sealed the letter. Checked his rifle. Almost nagant. Old, but reliable. He had killed his first deer with a rifle like this when he was 12 years old. The train east began to move, carrying Dmitri and 5,000 other Siberian soldiers toward Moscow, toward the Germans, toward a reckoning that neither side could yet imagine. Back at the front, Otto's squad huddled around a small fire. The snow had stopped, but the cold remained. They had wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they possessed. But it wasn't enough. The uniforms had been designed for summer. Lightweight, breathable, inadequate. My feet are numb. Dieter complained. Move around. Franz advised. Don't let the cold settle in. Keep your blood flowing. They stamped their feet, swung their arms, tried to generate warmth through motion. It helped. A little, but the cold was relentless. Hans pulled out a flask. I've been saving this. Might as well share it now. They passed the flask around. Terrible schnapps that burned going down. But the warmth was real. Temporary, but real. To Brotherhood, Hans said, raising the flask before taking his sip. To getting through this together. To Brotherhood. They echoed. Otto drank his share. The alcohol traced a line of fire down his throat. He handed the flask to Franz, who took a careful sip and passed it to Dieter. In that moment, cold and far from home, but surrounded by brothers, Otto felt something he couldn't quite name. Not happiness, not peace, but a kind of acceptance. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The snow began to fall again, heavier. This time, the wind picked up, carrying the flakes in horizontal sheets. Temperature dropping. Already, -15. October 30th, 1941. The Russian winter had arrived. And 300 kilometers to the east, Moscow waited, prepared, defiant. The lightning war was about to meet the frozen hell. November came with teeth. The temperature plummeted overnight from -10 to -25 degrees Celsius. Otto woke to find his breath frozen on the inside of his thin blanket. A crystalline crust of ice that crackled when he moved. His feet had gone completely numb during the night. He couldn't feel his toes at all. Around him, the rest of the squad stirred slowly. Movement had become difficult. Every muscle ached from the constant shivering. Hans sat up, his face pale, dark circles under his eyes. I dreamed I was home, Hans said quietly, in front of my mother's fireplace. I could feel the heat, smell the wood smoke. He looked down at his hands, wrapped in strips of torn cloth. Then I woke up to this. Franz was already up, checking the squad's equipment. The veteran's face had taken on a grim, haunted quality. He picked up his rifle, worked the bolt. It moved stiffly. The oil had begun to thicken in the cold. We need to clean these again. Third time this week. The lubricant isn't holding up. Dieter, the youngest, hadn't moved yet. He lay curled in a tight ball, shaking violently. Franz moved to him, shook his shoulder. On your feet, kid. Staying still will kill you faster than moving. I can't feel my hands, Dieter whispered. Franz, I can't feel them. Franz pulled the boy's hands from his armpits, where he'd been trying to warm them. The fingers were white, Not pale? White? The color of dead flesh. Franz's jaw tightened. Otto, Hans, get a fire going. Oh. Now, we need to warm him up, or he's going to lose these fingers. They scrambled to gather wood, precious fuel they couldn't spare. But Dieter's hands hung in the balance. They built a small fire, fed it carefully, and Franz held Dieter's hand over the flames. Slowly, painfully, color began to return. Dieter cried out as sensation came back. A burning agony, worse than the numbness. There you go, Franz said softly. Pain means the tissue's still alive. You'll keep your fingers? This time. The words hung in the cold air. A promise and a threat. This time, Dieter had been saved. But there would be other times, other mornings, and the cold was only getting worse. Lieutenant Colonel Richter stood outside his command vehicle, watching his battalion prepare for the day's advance. They were 15 kilometers from Klin, 30 kilometers from Moscow. So close. They could almost see the golden domes of the Kremlin on clear days, glinting in the weak winter sun. But his battalion was dying, not from enemy action, from the cold. In the past week, he had lost 40 men, not killed in combat, frozen to death. They simply stopped breathing during the night. Their hearts gave out. Or they fell asleep on a watch and never woke up. Their bodies found in the morning, covered in frost, faces peaceful, as if death had been a relief. And that didn't count the casualties from frostbite. 200 men with blackened fingers or toes. 50 who would need amputations. His battalion surgeon worked around the clock with a bone saw and a bottle of vodka for anesthesia, cutting away dead flesh to save lives. The medical tent had become a chamber of horrors. Men screaming. The smell of gangrene. The sound of the saw cutting through frozen bone. Richter forced himself to visit every day, to see what his men endured, to bear witness. His adjutant approached with the morning reports. The young lieutenant's nose had turned black from frostbite 3 days ago. It would have to come off eventually. But there was no time for non-essential surgery. Sir, High Command has issued new orders. We're to assault Klin immediately. Break through to the Moscow defensive perimeter within 48 hours. Richter read the orders carefully, then read them again. His hand trembled slightly. Not from cold, from rage. They want us to attack in minus 25-degree weather, with men who can barely walk from frostbite, with weapons that jam every third shot. Because the oil has turned to paste, those are the orders. Sir. Richter crumpled the paper, then smoothed it out again. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. He had spent his entire adult life believing in the chain of command. In obedience, in the certainty that higher command knew better, saw the bigger picture. But looking at his frozen, suffering battalion, he wondered if for the first time if perhaps they were all being led to slaughter by men who had no idea what was happening on the ground. Prepare the battalion for assault, he said finally. We attack Klin at dawn tomorrow. The adjutant saluted and departed. Richter stood alone in the bitter cold, minus 25 degrees. And this was only November. December and January still lay ahead. What would the temperature be then? Minus 30, minus 40. He thought of the supply reports. No winter clothing scheduled to arrive for another month, assuming the supply lines could even function in deep winter, assuming anything could function. For the first time since June 22nd. Klaus Richter allowed himself to think a thought that felt like treason. We cannot win this. Otto's squad received their orders that evening. They would lead the assault on Klin, advance through the southern sector, clear the residential buildings, secure the bridge across the small river that ran through town. Franz gathered them around a crude map drawn in the snow. Klin is defended. Soviet forces have had weeks to prepare. They'll be dug in. Every building will be a fortress. We go in fast and hard. Don't Stop. Don't get pinned down. If you stop moving in this cold, you die. Hans checked his rifle for the 10th time. What about support? Artillery. Tanks. Half the tanks won't start, Franz said flatly. Artillery, shells, are unreliable in this cold. The explosives don't detonate properly. We're going in mostly on our own. Silence fell over the group. This was suicide. They all knew it. But what choice did they have? Refuse. Retreat. There was nowhere to go. Moscow lay ahead. A frozen wasteland lay behind. The only way was forward. Otto felt his hands shaking. Not from cold. From fear. Real. Visceral. Fear. He had been in combat dozens of times now. But this felt different. This felt like walking deliberately into a grave. Hans noticed it, reached over and gripped Otto's shoulder. Hey, farm boy, look at me. Otto met his best friend's eyes. We've been through everything together, Hans said quietly. Poland, France, 3 months in this frozen hell. We're brothers, real brothers. And brothers don't let each other fall. You understand? Otto nodded, not trusting his voice. I'll watch your back. Hans continued. You watch mine. We do this together. We survive together. Together. Otto managed. Franz pulled out a flask. Not schnapps this time. Vodka. Taken from a capturer's Soviet supply depot. He passed it around. Each man took a long pull. The alcohol burned, warmed, gave them something to hold on to. Dieter, hands still bandaged from his morning frostbite scare, took his drink and looked at the older men with eyes that had aged decades in just weeks. If I don't make it, he said suddenly, tell my mother I was brave, even if I wasn't. Tell her I died well. You'll tell her yourself, Franz said firmly, and we all go home. That's the plan. But Otto heard the uncertainty in Franz's voice. The veteran had stopped believing in plans. November 15th, 4:30 in the morning. Still dark, still bitterly cold. Otto's squad moved forward with 200 other soldiers. Their boots crunched in the snow. Each breath came out as white fog. The frozen air seared their lungs with every inhalation. Klin lay ahead, dark, silent, waiting. The attack began with an artillery barrage. 20 guns, half of them misfired. The shells that did explode created surprisingly small craters in the frozen ground. The earth was so hard that the explosive force dissipated upward instead of outward. Then the infantry went in. Otto ran through snow that came up to his knees. His legs burned with effort. Beside him, Hans struggled forward. Behind them, Franz led a second wave. Dieter moved in the middle of the formation, trying to stay close to the veteran. Soviet machine guns opened up from the buildings. Muzzle flashes in the darkness. Tracers arcing through the air. Beautiful and deadly. Men fell. Otto heard screams, saw bodies crumpling into the snow. Blood spreading in dark stains against the white. Don't stop, Franz roared. Keep moving. They reached the first building. Hans kicked in the door. Otto followed him inside, rifle ready. Darkness. The smell of smoke and unwashed bodies. Movement? In the shadows. A Soviet soldier emerged from a doorway. Young. Terrified. Rifle shaking in his hands. Hans fired first. The Soviet soldier fell backward. A dark hole appearing in his chest. He hit the floor and didn't move. More gunfire from upstairs. Franz led a team up the stairs. The sound of grenades. Explosions. Screaming in Russian. Then silence. They cleared the building room by room. Found 3 more Soviet soldiers. 2 were already wounded from the artillery. They surrendered immediately. Hands up! Begging, in Russian, for mercy. Franz gestured toward the door. Take them outside. The rear guard will handle prisoners. They moved to the next building, and the next. The battle became a blur of violence and terror, kicking in doors, throwing grenades, firing into smoky rooms. Bodies everywhere. Soviet and German mixed together. Otto lost track of time, lost track of how many buildings they'd cleared. His hands worked mechanically. Load, aim, fire, reload, over and over. His mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere quiet and safe. Only his body remained, moving through the nightmare on pure instinct. They reached the town square just as dawn began to break, pale gray light revealing the devastation. Buildings on fire, bodies in the snow, wounded men crying for help in German and Russian. Franz did a head count. 20 men had entered the square with them. 15 remained. 5 casualties. Not bad, considering they had taken worse losses before. Then Franz's expression changed. He looked around frantically. Where's Dieter? They searched, called his name, retraced their steps to the last building they'd cleared, found him in a doorway, sitting against the wall, eyes open, frost on his eyelashes. Dead? Otto knelt beside the boy, touched his face, cold, hard as stone. No wounds, no blood. Dieter had simply frozen to death. Probably sat down to rest for just a moment. The cold had taken him before he could stand up again. 18 years old. Dead. Not from a bullet. From the weather. Hans made a sound. Not quite a sob. Not quite a scream. Something in between. He turned away, shoulders shaking. Franz closed Dieter's eyes gently. We'll come back for him. Mark the position. After the battle, we'll give him a proper burial. They marked the doorway with a piece of white cloth, left Dieter sitting there, frozen forever in the moment of his death. Moved on, because there was nothing else they could do. The battle for Klin continued through the morning. By noon, German forces had pushed the Soviets back to the river. By evening, they held half the town. The next dawn brought the final assault. By mid-morning of November 16th, Klin had fallen. Victory. Another town taken. Another step toward Moscow. The cost, 300 German casualties. 2/3 of them from frostbite and hypothermia. Only 1/3 from actual combat. Otto's squad had lost Dieter, but they had survived. 4 of them left now. Otto, Hans, Franz, and 3 replacements, who joined them from other decimated units. They buried Dieter in the frozen ground. It took 4 men with pickaxes 2 hours to dig a grave. The earth was like iron. When they finally lowered Dieter's body into the shallow hole, Franz said a few words. He was a good soldier, a good kid. He deserved better than this. Hans placed Dieter's helmet on the crude cross they'd made from scrap wood. Otto stood in silence, unable to find words. They filled in the grave, packed the frozen earth down, left the cross standing alone in the snow. One more grave among thousands. One more boy who would never see home. For 3 weeks, Otto's squad held Klin against relentless Soviet probing attacks. Every night brought artillery fire. Every dawn brought snipers. They had paid in blood for this town on November 15th and 16th. Now they paid again daily to keep it. The cold grew worse. The replacements who had joined them after the battle didn't last long. One froze to death on watch. Another lost both feet to frostbite and was evacuated. The third deserted one night and was never seen again. By early December, it was just the 3 of them again. Otto, Hans, and Franz. The original Brotherhood, minus Dieter. That night, as they huddled in a captured Soviet bunker, Franz pulled out something he had been carrying, a photograph in a leather wallet. His daughters, 10 and 12 years old, smiling at the camera. I haven't looked at this in weeks, Franz said quietly. Too painful. But now, he stared at the photograph. I need to remember why we're doing this, what we're trying to get back to. Otto watched the veteran's face, saw the cracks forming, the doubt spreading like ice across a frozen lake. Do you think we'll make it home? Franz. The veteran didn't answer immediately. He traced his finger across the photograph, over his daughters' faces. I don't know anymore. I used to be certain. Now, now I just don't know. 3 days later, a patrol brought in a prisoner. Not a regular soldier. A Soviet political commissar, wounded in the leg. Defiant. Despite his injury, Lieutenant Colonel Richter personally conducted the interrogation. He spoke some Russian, enough to communicate. The commissar was surprisingly forthcoming. "You're going to lose," the commissar said. His accent was thick, but his German was understandable. "You think you're winning? Taking our cities, killing our soldiers. But you're walking into a trap." Richter leaned forward. "What trap?" The commissar smiled, blood on his teeth from where he'd been hit during capture. "Our land, our winter. You came with your fast tanks and your lightning war. But Russia cannot be conquered quickly. And you're running out of time. We'll be in Moscow within weeks, perhaps. But then what? You hold Moscow, and winter destroys you. Your supply lines are already breaking. Your vehicles failing. Your men freezing. Every kilometer you advance, you get weaker. We get stronger. You're losing entire armies. Yes. And behind each army is another. And another. We have endless reserves. Endless land. Endless winter. What do you have? 600 kilometers of frozen supply line. Men in summer uniforms. Tanks that won't start. You came to conquer Russia. Instead, Russia is conquering you." Richter felt something cold settle in his chest. Not the weather. Something deeper. Recognition. Because the commissar was right. Every word was truth. Stalin planned this. The commissar continued. Drew you in. Let you advance. Stretched you thin. And now winter comes. Our ally. Our weapon. You cannot fight winter with technology. The interrogation ended. The commissar was taken away. Richter sat alone in his command post, staring at maps that suddenly looked like elaborate diagrams of a trap. They had advanced 600 kilometers, deep into the heart of Russia, away from their supply bases, away from safety. And winter had only just begun. He drafted a message to high command, detailed, honest, explained the supply situation, the casualty rates from cold, the deteriorating combat effectiveness, requested permission to halt the advance, consolidate positions, wait for proper winter equipment before proceeding. The response came back within hours. Terse, uncompromising. Continue, advance. Moscow must fall. Halting is not an option. Winter clothing. En route? Richter read the message 3 times. Felt his faith in the high command die a little more with each reading. Winter clothing en route. He had been hearing that for 6 weeks. Nothing had arrived. Nothing was coming. They were going to freeze to death because someone in Berlin was too proud to admit they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He thought about the men under his command, good soldiers, good Germans, freezing to death because of lies and promises that would never be kept. For the first time in his military career, Klaus Richter considered disobedience. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Retreat, pull back, save who you can." Damn the orders. But he was a soldier. Obedience was everything. Duty was everything. He crumpled the message and continued planning the advance. December arrived with unprecedented savagery. The temperature dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius, then minus 40, numbers that didn't seem real, numbers that couldn't be survived. But somehow, they survived. Day after day, hour after hour, moving forward. Because stopping meant death. Otto's squad had been reinforced with new men, replacements from other units that had been destroyed. None of them lasted long. The cold took them one by one. On December 4th, they encountered something that would haunt Otto for the rest of his life. A German position. Different, Battalion. 40 men had been stationed there a week ago. The squad approached cautiously, expecting to find the position manned. Instead, they found corpses, 30 of them, frozen solid, standing, sitting, lying in various positions like macabre statues. But 10 men were still alive. Technically alive, they sat around the frozen bodies of their comrades, and they were eating them. Otto saw it first, a soldier gnawing on what had clearly been a human arm, the flesh frozen. The soldier's teeth red with blood and frostbite. Eyes wild, inhuman. Hans vomited, turned away, and retched violently into the snow. Franz raised his weapon. The soldiers eating the dead didn't even look up, lost in their own private hell beyond reason, beyond humanity. We have to, Franz began, then stopped. What could they do? Shoot these men. Report them. They were German soldiers driven to the unthinkable by starvation and cold. Back away, Franz said quietly. Slowly, we were never here. They retreated from the position. No one spoke. What words could possibly encompass what they had witnessed? That evening, Franz ordered the bodies burned, not buried. Burned, completely destroyed. No one asked why. They all understood. Better to erase this from existence than let evidence remain. Otto couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those wild, blood-stained faces. Human beings reduced to animals. Civilization stripped away by hunger and cold. Hans lay awake too. Otto could hear his friend's ragged breathing in the darkness. We're not going home, Hans whispered. Are we? Otto wanted to lie, wanted to offer comfort, but the words wouldn't come. I don't know. I'm scared. Otto, really scared. Not of dying, of becoming like them, of losing everything that makes me human. You won't. We won't. We're brothers. We keep each other human. Remember? Hans was quiet for a long time. Yeah. Brothers. By December 10th, Lieutenant Colonel Richter's battalion had been reduced to less than half strength. 400 men. Maybe less? Hard to keep accurate counts when men died during the night and weren't discovered until morning. His vehicles were almost entirely non-functional. The few tanks that could still move had to be thawed with fires built underneath them each morning, a process that took hours and consumed precious fuel. His weapons worked intermittently at best. Soldiers cleared their rifles constantly, but the cold still caused malfunctions. Sometimes a rifle would fire, sometimes it wouldn't. They couldn't rely on anything anymore. And the cold continued to intensify. -40, -45. The air itself became a weapon. Each breath hurt. Each moment of exposure threatened permanent damage. The battalion surgeon ran out of morphine. Amputations now happened with nothing but vodka and strips of leather to bite down on. The medical tent echoed with screams day and night. Richter visited every amputee personally, looked each man in the eye, took responsibility for their suffering. One soldier, barely 20, had lost both feet to frostbite. The surgeon had sawed through his legs at mid-calf. The boy lay on a dirty cot, fever-bright eyes, staring at nothing. I won't walk again, the boy whispered. I'll never walk again. No, Richter agreed. There was no point in lying. But you'll live. You'll go home. You'll see your family. What kind of life is that? A cripple. Richter had no answer. He squeezed the boy's shoulder and moved to the next cot. What kind of life indeed? That night, Richter made a decision. Orders be damned. He was going to save who he could. He called his senior officers together, spoke in a low voice. Treasonous words. We're going to retreat. Not far. Just enough to consolidate our positions. Shorten our supply lines. Give our men a chance to survive. His adjutant's face went white. Sir, High Command specifically forbade retreat. The Führer himself has ordered us to hold every meter of ground. The Führer isn't watching men freeze to death," Richter said coldly. "The Fuhrer isn't performing amputations without anesthesia. The Fuhrer isn't here. I am. And I'm ordering a tactical withdrawal." The officers looked at each other. Uncertainty, fear, but also something else, relief, because they all knew it was the right decision. "If High Command asks," Richter continued, "we were forced back by enemy action." Understood. They understood. But before the withdrawal could begin, the world changed. December 13th, evening, minus 42 degrees. Otto's squad was on patrol 3 kilometers outside Klin when they saw something that stopped them cold. Movement on the horizon, not Soviet stragglers, not partisans, something else. Otto raised his binoculars, stared, couldn't believe what he was seeing. An entire division, maybe more, marching in perfect formation. Thousands of men, all wearing white winter camouflage, all moving with the fluid ease of soldiers, completely comfortable in the cold. They were singing. Otto couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the sound carrying across the frozen landscape. Confident, strong, unbroken, fresh troops, Soviet reinforcements. But from where? The Red Army was supposed to be destroyed, bled white by months of catastrophic defeats. Hans looked through his own binoculars. Where did they come from? Franz's face had gone pale. Siberia. Those are Siberian divisions. Stalin must have pulled them from the Far East. But that's... Hans trailed off. The implications were staggering. If Stalin could redeploy entire divisions from Siberia, then the Soviet Union had resources far beyond what German intelligence had estimated. They weren't fighting a dying empire. They were fighting a vast, resilient nation that refused to die. Otto watched the Siberian soldiers marching. They moved on skis, glided across the deep snow effortlessly. Their equipment looked modern, well-maintained. Their faces showed no sign of the cold that was killing German soldiers by the hundred. One of the Soviet officers riding at the head of the column was Sergeant Dmitri Antonov. He had traveled 5,000 kilometers from Yakutsk. He was home now, in the cold, in his element, and he had come to kill Germans. The march continued, division after division. Fresh troops pouring toward Moscow from the depths of Siberia. Troops that had trained their entire lives to fight in exactly these conditions. Otto's squad reported what they had seen. The information went up the chain of command, reached Richter within hours. The lieutenant colonel read the report, did the mathematics. If this was happening on his sector, it was probably happening all along the front. Dozens of divisions, maybe hundreds of thousands of fresh Soviet troops, and his own battalion was down to 400 frozen, starving men with malfunctioning weapons. He thought about the Soviet commissar's words. You're walking into a trap. They hadn't been winning. They had been dying slowly. And now the trap was about to spring shut. Richter drafted one more message to High Command. His final attempt at honesty. Enemy reinforcements arriving in massive numbers. Winter conditions unsustainable. Recommend immediate strategic withdrawal to defensible winter positions. He sent it and waited. The response came at dawn. One sentence. All positions will be held. Retreat is forbidden. By order of the Fuhrer. Richter read it twice. Then very carefully, very deliberately, he tore the message into small pieces, watched them flutter to the floor of his command vehicle like snow. Prepare for defensive operations, he told his adjutant, and prepare for the worst. December 15th, the Soviet counteroffensive began. Not probing attacks, not limited assaults, a massive, coordinated offensive all along the Moscow front. 1 million men, 7,000 artillery pieces, 700 tanks. The sky lit up with Katyusha rockets. Soviet artillery hammered German positions with unprecedented ferocity. And behind The artillery came the Siberian divisions. Otto's squad was in Klin when it started. The town they had fought so hard to capture on November 15th and 16th. The town they had held for 3 brutal weeks against constant attacks. Now they would have to defend it against an onslaught beyond anything they had faced. The Katyusha barrage began at 5 a.m. The sound was unlike anything Otto had experienced. Not individual explosions, a continuous roar, the earth shaking, buildings collapsing, the air filled with smoke and flying debris. They huddled in a basement as the world ended above them. Hans clutched his rifle. Franz checked his ammunition. Otto counted his grenades. 5. Only 5 left. The barrage lifted after 30 minutes. In the sudden silence, they could hear something else. Engines, tanks, and beneath that, a sound that chilled Otto more than the weather ever could. Singing. Thousands of voices. Soviet soldiers advancing, singing victory songs. Here they come, Franz said. Stay together. Fight smart. And whatever happens, we don't surrender. They'll shoot POWs in this cold. Can't feed them. Can't house them. Easier to just execute us. They moved upstairs, took positions at windows. Otto saw them coming. White-clad soldiers moving on skis. T-34 tanks with wide treads that traverse the snow easily. Artillery supporting every advance. The Soviet assault hit Klin like a tidal wave. House-to-house fighting, room to room. Brutal. Close. Personal. Otto fired his rifle. It jammed after 2 shots. He cleared it frantically. Fired again. 1 Soviet soldier fell. Another took his place. And another. They kept coming. Endless. Unstoppable. A grenade came through the window. Franz grabbed it, threw it back. It exploded outside. Another grenade. This one rolled too far. Otto dove for cover. The blast threw him against the wall. His ears rang. The blood ran from his nose. Hans pulled him up. Can you fight? Otto nodded. Couldn't hear his own voice, but he could still shoot. Still kill. They fell back to the next building. Then the next, fighting a desperate retreat through the town they had captured at such terrible cost. Soviet soldiers were everywhere. Otto shot one at point-blank range. The man's blood sprayed across the snow. Red on white. Otto didn't even pause. Turned, fired at another, and another. He had become what he feared, a killing machine. Human only in shape. They reached the town square, the same square where they had found Dieter, frozen to death a month ago. Now they defended it. 20 German soldiers against 200 Soviets. Franz organized the defense. Make every shot count. Aim for officers, radio operators, anyone who looks important. Otto found a position behind an overturned cart, aimed carefully. Fired. A Soviet officer fell. Aimed again. Fired. Another down. But there were too many. For every Soviet they killed, 10 more appeared. A T-34 tank turned the corner. Its main gun swiveled toward their position. Otto knew what was coming. He pressed himself flat against the ground. The tank fired. The building behind him exploded, brick and wood and stone raining down. Something heavy hit Otto's back. Pain lanced through him, but he could still move, still fight. Hans was suddenly there, pulling rubble off Otto, blood on Hans's face from a shrapnel wound. Get up! We have to move! They ran. The tank fired again. Missed. Franz was shouting something. Otto couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears. They made it to another building, barricaded the door, caught their breath. Otto counted heads. 15 left. They had lost 5 in the square. The battle raged for hours. All day. Into the evening. The Soviets pressed harder. German resistance weakened. By nightfall, they were down to 8 men, trapped in a single building, surrounded, out of ammunition, out of hope. Franz gathered them together. His face was gray. He had taken shrapnel in the chest. Blood soaked his uniform. But he stayed on his feet through sheer will. We're going to try to break out. East. Back toward our lines. Maybe 10 kilometers. We move fast. We move quiet. And if anyone falls, we leave them. Understood. They nodded. What choice did they have? They waited until full dark, then slipped out through a back window. 8 men, moving through the snow like ghosts. Soviet patrols everywhere. They had to go slowly, carefully. 500 meters. 1,000. They made it out of Klin into the open countryside. Hope began to flicker. Then a Soviet patrol spotted them. Shouts in Russian. Rifle fire. Otto ran. Beside him. Hans ran. Behind them, Franz tried to keep up despite his wounds. An explosion. A mine. Franz had stepped on a mine. The blast threw him forward, tore his legs to pieces. Otto stopped. Turned back. Hans grabbed his arm. No. Franz said, if anyone falls, we leave them. I'm not leaving him. Otto pulled free, ran back to Franz. The veteran lay in the snow, legs gone from the knees down, bleeding out fast. Impossibly. Franz was still conscious. You stupid kid. Franz gasped. I told you. Leave me. Not happening. Otto grabbed Franz under the arms, started dragging him. The veteran screamed. Otto kept pulling. Soviet soldiers. Closing in. 50 meters. 40. Hans appeared beside him. I'll take his left side. You take his right? Together. They lifted Franz between them. Ran. Staggered. Franz's blood leaving a trail in the snow. The Soviet soldiers opened fire. Bullets snapped past. One caught Franz in the shoulder. He grunted. Didn't cry out. 20 meters to a tree line. 10. They made it to cover. Collapsed. Behind fallen logs. Soviet soldiers pursuing. Otto and Hans returned fire with their last ammunition. 3 shots each. That was all they had left. The Soviets took cover. A standoff. Dark. Cold. Silent, except for Franz's labored breathing. The veteran looked up at Otto and Hans. Blood on his lips. You boys shouldn't have come back. We're brothers, Hans said. Brothers don't leave each other. Franz smiled weakly. Brothers? Yeah? His hand reached into his jacket, pulled out the leather wallet. The photograph of his daughters. Tell them. Tell my girls their father loved them. Tell them I tried to get home. You'll tell them yourself, Otto said desperately. We're getting you out of here. But they all knew the truth. Franz was dying. Minutes left. Maybe less. The veteran pressed the wallet into Otto's hand. Take it. Remember I had a life before this. Remember I was human. Franz's breathing changed. Became shallow, rattling. His eyes found Otto's. Held them. Get home. Boy. Both of you. Get home and be good men. Don't let the war destroy who you are. His eyes closed. One final breath. Then nothing. Franz was gone. Otto and Hans sat in the frozen darkness, holding the body of the man who had been their leader, their protector, their father, in this frozen hell. Behind them, Soviet soldiers called to each other, organizing a flanking maneuver. We have to go, Hans whispered. Otto, we have to leave him. Otto placed Franz's wallet carefully in his own jacket. They laid the veteran's body down gently, closed his eyes. Then they ran into the darkness. 2 boys from Bavaria, brothers in all but blood, running for their lives through snow and night and bitter cold. Behind them, Klin burned. Moscow stood defiant. And the German army, the once invincible Wehrmacht, began its slow, agonizing retreat into hell. The Brotherhood had been broken. Franz was dead. Dieter was dead. Only Otto and Hans remained, and the winter had barely begun. December 16th, minus 43 degrees Celsius. Otto and Hans stumbled through the darkness. Franz's blood still wet on their hands despite the cold. They had been moving for 6 hours. East. Always east, toward German lines that might no longer exist. The landscape had become alien, unrecognizable. Snow covered everything in a white shroud. Trees stood like skeletal fingers reaching toward a black sky. The moon hung overhead, full and merciless, turning the world into a nightmare of silver and shadow. Hans fell. Otto helped him up. They kept moving. How far? Hans gasped. I don't know. Do you even know which direction we're going? East. I think they had no compass. No map. Only the stars and the desperate hope that if they kept moving, they might find safety. Behind them, kilometers back, Klin burned. The glow lit the horizon like a false dawn. Soviet artillery still hammered what remained of the German positions. They could hear the distant thunder of explosions, feel the ground trembling beneath their feet. Hans stopped suddenly, grabbed Otto's arm. Listen. Otto heard it. Voices. German voices. Close. They crept forward carefully. Found a German position. Not a front-line unit. A rear guard. 20 men huddled around a fire that they shouldn't have lit. Discipline had broken down. Survival trumped military protocol. Now, the sentry nearly shot them before recognizing German uniforms. Identify yourself. Private Otto Brenner. Private Hans Schmidt. 4th Panzer Grenadiers. Where are we? 5 kilometers east of Klin. What's left of it, anyway? They were brought to the fire, given hot soup. Terrible soup. Mostly water with a few scraps of horse meat. But it was hot, and they were alive. And for a moment, that was enough. A lieutenant questioned them. Young, maybe 25. Eyes haunted. Klin has fallen. Yes, sir. Otto reported. Soviet counter-offensive. Massive, coordinated. Siberian divisions. Fresh troops. They hit us at dawn and didn't stop. The lieutenant nodded slowly, like he had expected this. They're hitting everywhere. All along the front. We've lost half our positions in 2 days. High command is in chaos. No one knows what to do. Where's Lieutenant Colonel Richter? Otto asked. Our battalion commander. Richter. The lieutenant checked a list. 4th Panzer. Yes. He's 3 kilometers north. What's left of his battalion? Maybe 200 men. You're lucky you found us. Another kilometer south, and you'd have walked right into Soviet lines. Otto and Hans rested for 2 hours, then moved north toward Richter's position. They found it just before dawn. A cluster of buildings that had once been a collective farm, now converted into a makeshift fortress. But calling it a fortress was generous. It was a collection of freezing, dying men waiting for the end. They found Lieutenant Colonel Richter in what had been the farm's main house. He sat at a wooden table, maps spread before him. But he wasn't studying the maps. He was just staring at them, like answers might appear if he looked long enough. Richter had aged a decade since Otto last saw him. His face was gaunt, gray. The Knight's Cross still hung at his throat, but now it seemed like mockery, a reminder of past glory that meant nothing in this frozen hell. Brenner, Schmidt. Richter looked up. Oh, where's the rest of your squad? Dead, sir. Franz died last night. Dieter froze to death in Klin. We're all that's left. Richter nodded. Filed this information away with all the other death reports he had received. How many Soviet divisions did you observe in Klin? At least 3. Sir. Maybe more. All Siberian troops, well equipped. They moved like they were comfortable in the cold. Of course they are. Richter stood, walked to the window. Outside, his remaining men are huddled in whatever shelter they could find. We're fighting Russia itself. The land, the weather, the endless expanse. We thought we could conquer it with technology and speed. But Russia doesn't surrender to technology. He turned back to Otto and Hans. Get some rest. We're pulling back tomorrow. Consolidating with other units. shortening our lines. Pulling back. Sir, Hans asked, carefully. I thought the Führer ordered no retreat. Richter's expression hardened. The Führer isn't here. I am. And I'm not going to watch more men die for pride. He paused. That's off the record. Officially, we're conducting a tactical redeployment. Understood. Yes, sir. They found bunks in a corner of the building, collapsed onto them, fully clothed, too exhausted even to remove their boots. Sleep came instantly, black and dreamless. They woke to chaos, explosions, shouting, the distinctive sound of Katyusha rockets. The Soviets had found them. A rocket hit the barn where half the battalion had been sheltering. The structure collapsed in a ball of flame. Men ran from the wreckage, their uniforms burning. They fell in the snow, rolling, trying to extinguish the flames. Some succeeded, others didn't. Richter was outside, shouting orders, organizing a defense. But there was nothing to defend with. Most of the battalion's heavy weapons had been abandoned. Ammunition was critically low. They had maybe 50 men combat effective, and from the north came Soviet infantry. Hundreds of them, white-clad, moving fast on skis. T-34 tanks supporting the advance. Fall back, Richter roared. Everyone fall back to the secondary position. What secondary position? There was nowhere to go, just open snow and certain death. They ran anyway, because standing still meant dying where you stood. Otto and Hans ran together, always together, brothers. They had made it this far by staying close. They would make it further the same way. An explosion threw Hans forward. He landed hard, didn't move. Otto's heart stopped. He skidded to a halt, dropped to his knees beside his friend. Hans, talk to me. Hans coughed, rolled over, blood on his face from a shrapnel wound. But alive. I'm okay. Help me up. They ran. Behind them, Soviet soldiers overran the farm. German resistance collapsed. Those who could run did. Those who couldn't surrendered or died. Otto saw Richter ahead. The colonel was limping badly, favoring his left leg, blood soaking through his trousers. They caught up to him. Sir, you're hit. Shrapnel. Richter gasped. Leg. I can walk. But he couldn't walk. Not fast enough. Not far enough. He took 3 more steps and collapsed. Otto and Hans caught him. We've got you. Sir, leave me? Richter ordered. That's an order. Save yourselves. Otto looked at Hans. Hans looked back. And without a word, they made their decision. No, sir, Otto said. We don't leave our own. They lifted Richter between them, one arm over each shoulder. Started moving. Slower now? Much slower, but moving. They walked for hours. The colonel passed in and out of consciousness, mumbling, delirious from pain and blood loss. Otto and Hans kept moving, step after step, through snow that came to their knees, through cold that turned their muscles to iron. Other survivors joined them. 12 men, then 8, then 5. Men falling behind, unable to keep up, left in the snow to freeze. Night fell. The temperature dropped further, -45. Otto couldn't feel his feet anymore, couldn't feel his hands. Just kept moving because stopping was death. Hans stumbled, nearly fell. Otto caught him. Stay with me. We're almost there. Almost where? Hans laughed bitterly. There's nowhere to go. Otto, we're going to die out here. We're not dying. Franz told us to get home. We're getting home. Franz is dead. Yes, and we're not. We keep moving. We survive. For him. For Dieter. For everyone we lost. They walked through the night. Into the next day. The landscape was littered with frozen corpses. German soldiers who had fallen during the retreat. Standing where they died. Sitting. Lying down. All of them covered in frost. All of them dead. December 18th. They had been walking for 3 days. Richter was barely conscious. Otto and Hans were both wounded, exhausted, starving, frostbitten. But alive? They crested a small hill and saw movement ahead. Soldiers. For a moment, hope flared. German uniforms. Safety. Rescue. Then Otto looked closer. White camouflage. Soviet soldiers. At least 50 of them. A full platoon. They were surrounded before they could react. Rifles pointed at them from all sides. Soviet voices shouting commands in Russian. Hans looked at Otto. This is it. Otto thought about Franz's words. They'll shoot POWs. Can't feed them. Easier to execute. A Soviet sergeant stepped forward. Dmitri Antonov, 34 years old. Siberian hunter. He had been tracking this group of Germans for 2 days, playing cat and mouse, letting them exhaust themselves. Now he had them. Dmitri looked at the three Germans, 2 young boys, barely out of their teens, 1 wounded officer, all of them on the verge of death from exposure. The regulations were clear. POWs in winter were a liability. Food was scarce. Shelter was scarce. Better to eliminate them and move on. Dmitri raised his rifle. Otto closed his eyes, waited for the bullet. It didn't come. He opened his eyes. Dmitri was staring at him. Something in the Soviet sergeant's expression had changed. He lowered his rifle slightly. Dmitri spoke in broken German. How old? 19. Otto replied, his voice barely a whisper. Dmitri nodded slowly. He had a son, 19 years old. Back in Yakutsk. He hadn't seen the boy in 2 years. Probably would never see him again. War consumed everything. These German boys were the enemy. They had invaded his homeland, killed his people, burned his cities. They deserved death. But looking at them, frozen and wounded and terrified, Dmitri saw only children. Boys who had been sent to war by madmen. Boys who were paying the price for their leader's hubris. He made a decision that violated every regulation, every order, every principle of war. You surrender. Otto nodded frantically. Yes, we surrender. Dmitri turned to his men, spoke in rapid Russian. Some of them protested, argued. Why waste food and supplies on the enemy? Dmitri cut them off with a sharp command. His men fell silent. He turned back to Otto and Hans. You come at. We have fire. Food. You live. He pointed at Richter. Officer needs the doctor.
We have doctor.
Otto couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're helping us? Dmitri's expression was hard to read. War is war. But you are beaten. Winter punished you more than we ever could. Enough. Death. They were led to a Soviet field camp. Given blankets, real blankets, thick and warm. Given soup, actual soup with meat and potatoes. Given medical attention. A Soviet doctor examined Richter's leg wound, shook his head. Infection. Bad, but maybe survivable if treated quickly. Otto and Hans sat by a fire. Real fire. Heat. For the first time in weeks, they felt warm. Hans stared at the Soviet soldiers around them. They're feeding us. Why are they feeding us? I don't know. A Soviet soldier, young, maybe 20, approached them, offered cigarettes. Russian cigarettes. Harsh and strong. But tobacco. Otto and Hans accepted gratefully. The Soviet soldier spoke no German, but he gestured, made smoking motions, smiled. A universal language of shared humanity. They smoked in silence. Enemy soldiers sitting around the same fire, sharing warmth, sharing a moment of peace in the midst of hell. Dmitri approached them, sat down across from them, pulled out a photograph, showed it to Otto. A family, woman, boy, girl, all smiling. My family, Dmitri said in his broken German. Wife, son, daughter. In Yakutsk, very far east. Otto understood. Dmitri was showing him that he too was human, had a family, had a life beyond war. Otto reached into his jacket, pulled out Franz's wallet. The photograph of Franz's daughters. My sergeant. He died 3 days ago. His daughters. In Germany. Dmitri looked at the photograph. Something passed across his face. Sorrow. Recognition. He was good man. Yes. The best. Dmitri nodded. Handed the photograph back carefully. War makes us kill good men. This is tragedy. They sat in silence for a long time. Two soldiers from opposite sides of a brutal war, sharing grief, sharing humanity. That night, Otto slept without nightmares for the first time in months. The warmth, the food, the simple act of mercy had reminded him that he was still human, that humanity still existed. But morning brought reality crashing back. Soviet officers arrived, took command. Dmitri's mercy was overruled. The prisoners were to be transported to a POW camp, 15 kilometers west. They would walk there. Those who couldn't keep up would be left behind. Richter could barely stand. The infection in his leg had spread overnight, despite treatment. Fever burned in his eyes. He needed surgery, antibiotics, proper medical care. None of those things were available. They walked, Otto and Hans, supporting Richter between them. The journey took all day. Richter's condition deteriorated with every step. By the time they reached the camp, he was unconscious. The POW camp was worse than Otto had imagined. Barbed wire, guard towers, barracks that provided minimal shelter from the cold. Thousands of German prisoners, all of them starving, many dying. They were processed. Names, ranks, service numbers. Then shoved into a barracks with 200 other prisoners. No heat, minimal rations, disease everywhere. Richter was taken to the camp hospital, such as it was. A tent with a few cots. A Soviet doctor who did what he could with almost no supplies. Otto visited every day, watched the colonel fade. On December 30th, Richter regained consciousness for the last time. His leg had gone gangrenous. Black. The smell of death. The Soviet doctor had wanted to amputate, but Richter had refused. Why prolong the inevitable? Otto sat beside the cot, held the colonel's hand. Richter's voice was barely audible. Brenner, you're alive. Yes, sir. Hans, too. We're both alive. Good. Good. Richter coughed. Blood flecked his lips. I was wrong. All of us were wrong. We believed the lies, believed in victory, believed we could conquer this land. His eyes found Otto's. Tell them the truth. When you get home, tell them what pride costs, what hubris destroys. You'll tell them yourself. Sir. Richter smiled weakly. No, I won't see Germany again, but you will. You and Schmidt. You're young, strong, survivors. Get home. Tell the truth. His grip tightened on Otto's hand. Promise me. No more lies. No more propaganda. Just truth. The brutal, terrible truth of what we did here. I promise. Sir. Richter's eyes closed. His breathing became labored, rattling. Otto stayed with him, held his hand, bore witness to the death of a man who had tried to do right in an impossible situation. At 2:17 p.m. on December 30th, 1941, Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Richter died. Not in glory, not in battle, in a freezing tent in a Soviet POW camp. From an infected wound and the betrayal of the high command he had served faithfully for 25 years, Otto closed Richter's eyes, added his death to the long list of losses. Franz, Dieter, Richter, so many others, all dead, all gone. But Otto was still alive. Hans was still alive. They had survived. That night, unable to sleep, Otto searched through his pack, looking for something, anything, a connection to what he had lost. He found it. A letter. Hans's handwriting, addressed to Hans's mother in Bavaria. Otto's hands trembled as he opened it. This was private, personal, but something told him he needed to read it. The letter was dated December 14, 2 days before Franz died. Hans must have written it during a quiet moment and forgotten to mail it. Dear Mother, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I need you to know some things. I've made a friend here. His name is Otto Brenner. He's from a village near ours. Did you know that we're practically neighbors? But it took a war to bring us together. Otto is more than a friend. He's my brother. Real brother. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. Loyalty does. And I love Otto like I've never loved anyone except you and Papa. We've been through hell together. Real hell. The kind that breaks men. But we've kept each other human. Kept each other sane. When I wanted to give up, Otto pulled me forward. When he faltered, I caught him. That's what brothers do. If I die and Otto lives, take care of him. Bring him into our family. Tell him he's my brother, and he always will be. Tell him to live for both of us, to have the life I won't get to have, and tell him I'm grateful for every moment, every laugh, every cigarette we shared, every time he saved me or I saved him. Tell him he made this bearable. He made me remember I was human. I love you, Mother. I love Papa. I love our little village and our big stupid country. But most of all, I love Otto, my brother, my friend. Take care of him. Promise me. Your son, Hans. Otto read the letter 3 times. Tears froze on his cheek. He looked across the barracks to where Hans slept. His friend, his brother. Hans had written this 2 weeks ago, preparing for death, making arrangements, and somehow, impossibly, they were both still alive. Otto carefully folded the letter, put it back in his pack. He would keep it, treasure it, and someday, if they made it home, he would show it to Hans's mother and tell her that yes, they were brothers, always would be. February 1942. The worst of winter had passed. Temperatures rose to a relatively balmy -20, almost comfortable compared to the -40 they had endured. Otto and Hans had survived. Barely. Both had lost toes to frostbite. Hans had lost parts of 3 fingers. Otto's feet would never be the same. But they were alive. The POW camp population had decreased dramatically. Disease, starvation, exposure, thousands dead, buried in mass graves when the ground thawed enough to do. But Otto and Hans survived. They worked together, shared everything, protected each other. Brotherhood keeping them alive when everything else tried to kill them. They learned carpentry. A Soviet guard, unexpectedly kind, taught them to make simple furniture. Something to do, something to focus on besides hunger and cold and the endless waiting. Dmitri visited once. In February, he wasn't stationed at the camp, but had requested permission to check on the prisoners he had captured. He found Otto and Hans in the carpentry shop. They looked up, recognizing him immediately. "You live," Dmitri said, almost surprised. "Yes, thanks to you," Otto replied. His Russian had improved. Basic phrases. Enough to communicate. Dmitri pulled out a package. "Bread, cheese, precious food. For you and your brother. Hans is my brother." Otto confirmed. "Not by blood, but yes, my brother." Dmitri understood. "Good. Brothers survive. Alone. Mendes. Together. Man lives." He left the food and departed. Otto and Hans shared it. Half and half? Exactly. Equal. The way brothers should. April 1942. Spring arrived. Snow melted. The camp became a sea of mud. But temperatures rose. The killing cold retreated. Word filtered in from the outside world. Moscow had held. The Germans had been pushed back 200 kilometers. The myth of Wehrmacht, invincibility, had been shattered. But the war continued. On and on. No end in sight. Otto thought about Richter's words. Tell them the truth. He would, someday, if he survived, The years passed. 1940 became 1943, became 1904, became 1945. The war ground on. Otto and Hans remained prisoners. They worked, survived, waited. News came in May 1945. Germany had surrendered. Unconditionally. The war was over. The prisoners cheered, cried, couldn't believe it. Over, finally over. Repatriation took months, processing thousands of POWs, verifying identities, arranging transport. Otto and Hans were released in September 1945, 4 years after their capture. They walked out of the camp together. Brothers, survivors. The journey home took 3 weeks, across a devastated Europe, through cities reduced to rubble, past graves and memorials, and the ruins of a civilization that had destroyed itself. They reached Bavaria in October. Hans's village first. His family home still stood. Miraculous. His mother answered the door, saw her son, and collapsed to being. Hans held her, let her cry, then introduced Otto. Mother, this is Otto Brenner. He's my brother. We survived together. Can he stay with us? For a while. Hans's mother looked at Otto, saw the scars, the missing toes, the hollow eyes of a man who had seen too much. Yes, of course. He's family. Otto stayed for 2 weeks, then traveled to his own village, his own family farm. Found it, much as he had left it. His parents, older, gray, but alive. They welcomed him home, fed him, loved him, tried to understand what he had become. But Otto couldn't stay. The farm felt wrong, too quiet, too peaceful. He didn't fit anymore. He became a teacher, moved to a small town, taught history. And every year, on the first day of class, he told his students about Moscow, about Franz and Dieter, about Richter, about Hans, about Dmitri. He told them the truth, the brutal, terrible truth that Richter had made him promise to tell. War is not glory, he would say. War is not the honor. War is frozen. Boys dying in the snow. War is good men, like Sergeant Franz bleeding out in minefields. War is pride destroying nations and hubris killing millions. He told them about Brotherhood, how Hans had saved him, how he had saved Hans, how they had kept each other human when everything tried to make them monsters. And he told them about mercy, how Dmitri, the enemy, had shown more humanity than their own command, how a Soviet sergeant had risked court-martial to give bread and blankets to dying German boys. Mercy, Otto would say, is what separates us from animals. Technology fails. Pride falls. Nations collapse. But mercy endures. The students listened. Some understood. Others didn't. But Otto told the story anyway. Year after year, keeping the promise. 1980. Otto Brenner stood at a memorial in Moscow. He was 63 years old now. Gray. Walking with a cane because his feet, damaged by frostbite 44 years ago, had never fully healed. The Soviet government had invited German veterans to a commemoration ceremony. Reconciliation, remembrance, healing. Otto had come. Hans beside him. Brothers still. They lived in the same town now, saw each other every day. Their children were friends. Their grandchildren played together. The memorial was beautiful. Black marble, names of the dead engraved in gold. Thousands of names, German and Soviet, all of them equal in death. Otto found what he was looking for, a section for Soviet soldiers. He traced his finger down the list until he found it. Dmitri Antonov, Sergeant, 78th Rifle Division, killed in action, January 1943. Kursk. Otto placed a flower at the base of the memorial. White. For peace. Thank you, he whispered in Russian.
For showing mercy.
for reminding me what humanity means. A Soviet veteran approached, old, missing an arm. He saw Otto's German insignia. For a moment, tension. Then the Soviet veteran spoke in broken German. You fought here. Yes. I was captured. December 1941. The Soviet veteran nodded slowly. You survived. Yes. Because a Soviet sergeant showed mercy. Fed us. Saved us. Even though we were enemies. The Soviet veteran's expression softened. That is Russia. We are hard people, but not cruel. Not when it matters. They stood together at the memorial. Two old soldiers from opposite sides of history's bloodiest war. United now by memory and loss and the hard-won wisdom of survival. Hans joined them, placed his own flower at the memorial. For Franz, for Dieter, for Richter, for all the boys who never made it home. That evening, Otto gave a speech at the ceremony. He spoke in German, translators rendering his words into Russian. He told the story, all of it. The truth. He told them about the frozen hell of Moscow, about boys dying in the snow, about the arrogance of believing technology could conquer nature, about the price of pride. And he told them about brotherhood, about mercy, about the things that endure when everything else fails. I learned something in the frozen hell of 1941, Otto said, his voice steady, despite the emotions. I learned that war destroys everything it touches. Nations, cities, lives. But it doesn't have to destroy humanity. Brotherhood can survive. Mercy can survive. Love can survive. He looked at Hans, his brother, standing beside him. After 44 years of friendship, we survived because we refused to become monsters, because we kept each other human, because even in hell, we remembered that the man beside us mattered more than victory, more than glory, more than anything. The audience listened in silence, German and Soviet veterans, all of them nodding, all of them understanding. Technology fails. Otto continued. Pride falls. Empires collapse. But brotherhood, mercy, humanity, these things endure. This is what Moscow taught me. This is the lesson I've spent my life sharing. He finished speaking. The audience applauded, not wildly, not enthusiastically, but with deep, sincere respect. The respect of people who understood, who had been there, who knew. That night, in his hotel room, Otto took out Hans's letter, the one written in December 1941. He had carried it for 44 years, read it hundreds of times. Every word memorized, but he read it again, because some truths never get old. Some words never lose their power. Otto is my brother. Real brother. Yes, they were brothers. Had been for 44 years. Would be until death. The frozen hell of Moscow had taken so much from them. Their youth, their innocence, parts of their bodies, friends, comrades, entire years of their lives. But it had given them something too, each other, brotherhood, the absolute certainty that they would never be alone. Otto folded the letter carefully, but put it back in his wallet. Next to the photograph of Franz's daughters. He had met them after the war, delivered their father's last message, watched them cry and grieve and eventually heal. They had invited Otto into their family, called him uncle. Their children called him grandfather. Franz's blood lived on, his memory honored. Otto turned off the light, lay in bed in a Moscow hotel room, 44 years after he had nearly died in this city. He thought about Dieter, dead at 18. What kind of man would he have become? He thought about Franz, who had saved them all, who had kept them human. He thought about Richter, who had tried to do right in an impossible situation. He thought about Dmitri, the enemy, who had shown mercy, who had saved their lives, who had died 2 years later on a different battlefield. So many dead, so many lost, but their lessons lived on. In Otto's teaching, in his life, in the Brotherhood, he and Hans had maintained for 44 years. The frozen hell of Moscow had been brutal, merciless, devastating, but it had also been the crucible in which true humanity was tested, where brotherhood was proven, where mercy triumphed over hatred, and lying in the darkness. 63 years old, scarred and broken and surviving, Otto Brenner smiled, because he had kept the promise. He had told the truth. He had honored the dead. He had survived with his humanity intact. The frozen hell had not destroyed him, had not made him a monster, had not stolen his soul. He had walked through hell with his brother beside him, and he had emerged on the other side still human, still capable of love, still able to believe in mercy. That was victory. The only victory that mattered. Outside, Moscow slept. The city that had refused to fall. The fortress that had broken the Wehrmacht. The place where winter and courage had combined to change the course of history. Otto closed his eyes. For once, no nightmares waited. Just peace, hard-earned, paid for, in blood and suffering and loss, but peace nonetheless. The frozen hell of Moscow had ended 44 years ago, but its lessons would last forever. Brotherhood endures. Mercy saves. Humanity survives, even in hell, especially in hell. This was the truth Otto had promised to tell, and he had kept that promise for 44 years, for the rest of his life, for Franz, for Dieter, for Richter, for Dmitri, for all of the brothers lost in the frozen hell, for Hans, still beside him after all these years, for every student who had listened to the story and learned. The promise was kept, the truth was told, and in the darkness of a Moscow night, Otto Brenner slept the sleep of a man who had survived hell and emerged with his soul intact. A survivor, a teacher, a brother, a witness to history's cruelest lesson and its most enduring truth. War destroys, but humanity endures. Always.